Hi all, Dr. Clark here again. Today for animal biology we're going to talk about some other phyla within the superphyla Lophotrochozoa. Now these phyla that we're going to talk about, Nemertea, Gastrotricha, Cycliophora, these phyla are much smaller than Platyhelminthes, yet they have a lot of characteristics similar to Platyhelminthes. So they're just unique kind of phyla, but they're also showing that transition. So remember, these Lophotrichozoans that we're talking about are acoelomates, they're triploblastic, they have bilateral symmetry. Often their digestive system is not complete. They don't have a complete circulatory system. They don't have multiple body regions. Okay? But we're going to start to see as we kind of progress through these other phyla, moving into mollusca and annelids and whatnot, we're going to start to see this transition, this evolution of the circulatory system, the evolution of the body regions, the evolution of having columns or going from pseudocoelomates to coelomates, etc. Okay, so that's why I kind of bring up these kind of unique phyla, is because they have some interesting features that we're going to see later on that kind of progress into more evolutionary features. All right, so the first one that I want to talk about is Nemertea, or the proboscis worms, or what's sometimes called the proboscis worms. And that's really because they have a proboscis or a probus, so a mouthpiece that is extendable, that allows for them to capture prey. Now, in some cases, the proboscis is just extended to wrap around the prey and then they can bring them in. In other cases, the proboscis is tipped with a stylite that has kind of a digestive enzyme, poison, on it that can be injected into the prey, and then the prey is digested from the inside, and then they can use the proboscis to kind of suck out the digestive juices and the material that was digested, so it leaves kind of an exoskeleton. Now, Nemerteans, when we look at Nemertea, that phyla, and compare it to Platyhelminthes, which had quite a few different parasites, Nemerteans are not parasites, but they have a similar body features or functions that Platyhelminthes do, but they're much larger. They're not all microscopic, and sometimes they're divers and scuba divers and photographers really like to take pictures of Nemerteans or the proboscis worms because they're often visually appealing. They'll prey on invertebrates and small aquatic creatures with their proboscis or probus. They have a one-way digestive system, so this is kind of an advancement that we're starting to see, is they have a mouth, kind of a tube, and you could say that they have a pharynx into kind of a stomach region, and then out through, which you would call an intestine system, where the nutrients are going to be removed, and out the anus. They have a blood vascular system that is starting to be more advanced, more developed, but again, it's still an open system, but they have a way at which the nutrients from the digestion will get into the tissues through kind of a flow system in their blood vascular system. And the sexes are separate, so they're dioecious. Now, remember, I said this before, but just because a species is monoecious or dioecious really doesn't determine the complexity of the organism. It's how they go about being dioecious or monoecious. We're going to start to see, as we progress, we'll start to see some organisms that are monoecious that are much more complex than organisms that are even dioecious. And we'll look at this in the near future. So here you can see this is just the basic anatomy of the proboscis worms or the Nemertea. Right? They have a mouth, a proboscis. Right? They have often a stylite, which will sometimes have a digestive enzyme or poison gland on it, which they can fire into a prey, or they can extend their proboscis and wrap it around the organism. There's a couple different ways at which that can occur. Okay, they have a mouth going into kind of a pharynx tube, into a stomach region, through the intestinal tract, and out the anus. Okay? And they also have like control centers for their nervous system. Depending on the individual, well, depending on the genera, how many they will have, it kind of depends. Often they'll have more than one, so they're not just going to have a super ganglion. They're not going to have a single brain. They'd have multiple ganglion to control the nervous system. Okay? But depends on kind of the group, how many they have. So here, they're often called ribbon worms or proboscis worms, and you can see why. They're typically brightly colored. You can see them with the naked eye. They're not microscopic, and they have that capability of firing that proboscis. All right, and the next phyla that we're going to talk about is Gastrica. Gastrica are aquatic animals, just like Nemertea, okay, but they're microscopic, and so these are not those large organisms. Okay? But we start to see the division of body parts. Okay, so you see a head, a neck, and kind of a trunk region, or what sometimes is considered a head, a thorax, and an abdomen, or a tail. So it's not true segments. Okay, so they're not segmented out or don't have distinct regions, but it's the precursor to having distinct regions. They have numerous adhesive glands, which is a little different. Kind of the evolution of these adhesive glands are different from the adhesive glands that we see in some of the other organisms. The chemicals that are used for the adhesion, okay, are a little bit different. So that plays a role as we progress and we start looking at some of the other mucus adhesive glands that we see in some of the other organisms in Lophotrochozoa are probably the result of this connection to Gastrica. Okay? And like I said before, sexual kind of orientation, whether you're monoecious or dioecious or hermaphroditic or practice parthenogenesis, really doesn't determine technically the complexity of the organism or how evolutionarily evolved they are, but rather what's the environment like in which they live in. Okay? So most Gastrica are hermaphroditic, so they're monoecious, but in some cases there are no males, and so they practice what we call parthenogenesis, and that's where there's just females in that species. And depending on if there's kind of a mating ritual or whatnot, you might have females acting like males that had once there once had been males in that group, or the females just go through parthenogenesis and different seasonality trigger them to fertilize their own eggs and produce offspring. The other thing that we see in Gastrica is a different formation of the protonephrita. So remember, the protonephrita is like the precursor to the kidney. It's a filtration system. And when we were looking at platyhelminthes, and we're looking at especially tubularians, when you examine the flame cells have a bunch of cilia, okay? And the material is passed across the cilia and filtered out, okay, through kind of like a lamellae or filtration system. Okay? In the case of Gastrica, same kind of flame cell situation setup, except for instead of a bunch of cilia and a bunch of hair-like structures, they have just a flagellum, a single kind of tail-like structure that allows for the flow of movement to go across the membranes. So it's a different setup, same general premise though, filtration and precursor to kind of the kidney of higher order organisms, which we'll get to kidneys in a little bit. Okay? So this is kind of the anatomy of a gastricant. Okay? Often these guys are called hair worms. Now that might be because of the bristles that are found all over their body, but it also could be a misnomer in the sense that a translation from the Latin name that was given to them to kind of a common name meant hair, and so I guess it could just be that they get called the hair worms, even though that's not really why. But they do have bristles throughout their body, sensory bristles, that allow for them to sense water movement and things like that. They have a mouth, and like I said before, okay, they have a straight intestinal tract. So mouth enters pharynx, okay, they kind of have this stomach region where you would have some glands, salivary glands that are associated, dropping digestive enzymes in there, and then through the intestinal tract on out the anus. Okay. The adhesive glands allow for them to deposit eggs in kind of an adhesive package, and that allows for them to kind of protect their eggs in the water column. Okay. All right, Cycliophora is a relatively new phyla, which is kind of interesting from perspective, and we're not, well, I shouldn't say we're not. The scientific community might not be in agreement with this phyla even being formed, since there's only 2 species in the entire phyla. Okay? The phyla was first originally discovered or written up for publication in, I think, 1996, and it wasn't later in the 2000s, early 2000s, that we found another species. But there are only 2 species within the phyla. It's a very unique grouping, and whether or not it actually belongs in its own phyla, but even within kind of this acoelomate triploblastic, that might be up for debate. Okay? The members of the phyla only live in the mouth parts of claw lobsters. Right, so it's very species specific. Right, so you could say that they're parasites from one perspective, but they're not taking much away from the claw lobster. They're there to kind of eat food that the lobster would be eating, or remnants of the food that the lobster would be eating, but they do become established in the mouth parts, so they adhere to the mouth parts. So here you can see it's a very different organism. It's not the general shape that you were expecting when you're talking about Nemerteans and the Gastrotricha. So they're not free swimming. They don't have a kind of one-way track intestinal system. They do, but it curves, it turns, and it's released back into the water column by the head of the organism, or the buccal cavity of the organism, which has tentacles on it. It's just a very unique system, and not very much is known about these this phyla, or about the species that belong within the phyla. So a lot more research needs to go into this. If they're found on claw lobsters, are they going to be found on, some of the other types of lobster, or is this really just, 2 unique species and they belong in their own phyla? That's to be determined at a later date. All right, so that's really the kind of the acoelomate triploblastic bilateral group of Lophotrochozoans. So that's that branch of Lophotrochozoans. We're going to talk about a different branch of Lophotrochozoans next, okay, which are have a little bit more complexity and are a little bit more familiar to most people. So when we're looking at the phylogenetics of Lophotrochozoans in this great group, there are some things that are fairly interesting. When we start looking at the free-swimming and free-form flatworms or tubellaria, right, they most likely gave rise, and so they evolved first from a common ancestor, and gave rise to the parasitic forms of flatworms. So remember when we were talking about tubellaria and we're talking about platyhelminthes, we're talking about cestoids and digenic flukes and monogenic flukes. Okay? The monogenic, digenic cestoids evolved most likely from tubellarians after the evolution of tegument. Okay? This outer kind of layer of protection, almost like an exoskeleton, not quite. Okay? So it's that evolution or that uniqueness of that kind of outer layering, okay, which we'll talk about, has some connection to the inner layering later on. Okay, and that shows this synapomorphy, this shared evolutionary derived character between the monogenes, the trematodes, and the cestoidae. Okay, so this is what it looks like on a phylogenetic tree. Tubellarians, those free-swimming flatworms, they have a bunch of different characteristics that they share common ancestry with from the other platyhelminthes. Okay, so like single ovaries, paired testes, these kind of things. But it's that development of tegument, okay, that really gave rise to those parasitic groups. Now, that's probably part of the reason why tegument was so successful. Tegument gives them that outer layer of protection. Okay? So if you're going to be in an organism's intestinal tract with different levels of pH, and you have immune function that's going to be attacking you, etc., having another layer of protection is probably a huge benefit. Okay? And so you start to see that these parasites have that protection, and then you can see how the parasite groups differ. So the Obstapter and Prothapter is monogene only. Okay, so that's a derived characteristic on this line. The ventral sucker comes from in the thing of trematodes. And then the cestoids have a bunch of things in which they lost. Okay? They lost their digestive tract, they lost their mouth, okay? They formed a scolex, okay? They have segmentation of the body. So cestoids are very kind of derived, lots of derived characteristics or losses of characteristics in which the other groups have. Okay? So again, we're moving through simpler animals. I don't want to say primitive because some of these are evolving just as fast as modern other animals that we're going to talk about, more derived animals. Okay, but a lot of these more simplistic animals have features in which we're going to see in the more derived animals, and we're going to see that connection, like the protonephra cells and that connection to the kidneys. Okay? We're going to start to see that some of these digestive glands, so whether that would be like a digestive gland that's just outside the stomach, we're going to start to see that connection to phyloric ceca, and then that connection from phyloric ceca to appendix. Okay? And you're going to start to see this progression towards more derived but also more specialized features, okay, that are found in a lot of the more derived animals. Okay, so with that, like I said before, we're going to move. We're still within Lophotrochozoa, but we're going to move to more derived organisms that are no longer acoelomates, some of which are going to be pseudocoelomates, and some which are going to be true coelomates. They're still going to be triploblastic. They're still going to have the 3 tissue types, and they're still going to have bilateral symmetry, but they're more derived. Now they have compartments, so you're going to see some specialization in different things like circulatory system, reproductive system, digestive system, etc., even nervous system. Okay, so next time we're going to talk about mollusca.